Welcome to another edition of Scholars in a Bar. I'm your host, Dr. Alan Eichelman, and today we are in the home of my good friend, Dr. J. Hakes. Dr. Hakes and I have a coincidental history with one another, meaning I didn't know this as I was growing up, but Jay grew up not too far from me in a town called Wheaton, Illinois. And Wheaton was the county seat of the county that I grew up in, DuPage County, in another town in that county, which is also part of the Chicagoland area. And Dr. Hakes then went on to Wheaton College, where he earned his bachelor's. And from Wheaton, he went on to do a PhD in political science at Duke. And I'm going to, introduce Dr. Hakes a little further in this interview. But before I do so, we're at Dr. Hakes' bar in his home. And he made this wonderful drink called Negroni. And with that, I'd like to say, Jay.
Okay.
Yeah, this is wonderful, Jay.
We'll see if you like Campari. That's the main ingredient. And
oh, it's very nice. It's very, very nice. Very good.
My favorite drink.
Yes. The reason we are here is because Dr. Hakes recently wrote and published this book called The Presidents and the Planet: Climate Change, Science, and Politics from Eisenhower to Bush. And that's Bush number one, George H. Bush. And interestingly enough, he does not go into the Clinton years. Why would that be important? Because one of Jake's jobs, and we might end up talking a little bit about this, was as the director of the Department of Energy Information under Bill Clinton. So that was one of his key jobs. And another job that he had, and we're going to be talking about that for sure, was he was the director of the Jimmy Carter Library in Atlanta. And that was his last gig before retiring and coming back to New Orleans. What do I mean coming back to New Orleans? Well, Jay, before he started actually entering into the political realm, was a professor of political science at the University of New Orleans. And so he has family here. And this is his bride, his wife's hometown. And they have now a beautiful home, which we are in uptown New Orleans. And so as I give you that kind of information about my good friend Jay Hakes, I'm just simply going to turn to Jay and say, Jay, it's so good to be with you today.
Yeah, Al, we get a chance to discuss all the big issues in the world, and we're going to do it again today on camera.
We seem like every time we get together, we end up doing that, don't we?
Yep.
Yes, we certainly do. Well, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about your book, and especially about your relationship to Jimmy Carter, since he is very much featured prominently in this book. And I know you I think it was just this past few days, you were at the Tulane University Book Festival and presenting this book. Would you like to say a little bit about that?
Well, for those who can come to New Orleans or are in New Orleans, this annual book fest is pretty amazing. And one of the reasons I was hanging out is Jonathan Alter, who's written one of the most recent books on Carter, was there. And I got to know him quite well when he was working on his Carter book. And we had Anthony Fauci and Jeff Goldberg and Bob Woodward and Doris Kearns Goodwin. So it was quite a gathering. Thousands of people were there and all the rooms were filled. And So Carter was one topic, but we had a good turnout. Our panel was on energy and environment, and there's a lot of interest in that.
And you guys had some tough competition last week for this book festival because it was also the time of the Tennessee Williams Festival.
Right. We had the Tennessee Williams Festival in the quarter, which is a very important group. And then there was a big environmental law conference at the Tulane campus. And there were things going on at Loyola. And my event was actually co-sponsored by the book festival and by the environmental law conference at Tulane. So maybe that helped a little bit with the crowd. But it's a very intellectually invigorating atmosphere that we live in. And it's interesting that some of these people that we see on TV a lot actually live in New Orleans. In the age of Zoom, someone that we might think lives in Washington or New York, because we see them on these programs all the time, they actually live here.
Well, such as James Carville, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, if you like to eat, that works out pretty well.
Yeah, it does really work out very, very well. And I guess it's just another example of things that go on in New Orleans that many people aren't even aware of. And they aren't aware of these intellectually stimulating events that go on in our city because maybe they associate New Orleans with the first 6 blocks of Bourbon Street, which is not intellectually stimulating in the least little bit.
Well, they were pretty clever at Tulane. The title for this year was the Mardi Gras of the Mind. And they had their own logos and everything. But the only thing that bothered me, and I guess reflects the age we live in, is they did not take questions from the audience. And before every event, they ran a recording saying that disruptive behavior would not be allowed. That did bother me because I've been in university life for many, many decades, and it seems like we've entered a period where we've become more fearful. But that didn't impede the discussion by the people with the microphones. We were all very, very candid, but unfortunately the audience didn't get a chance to ask questions.
I know that you've delivered a couple of lectures at my university, graciously agreed to deliver these lectures at my university, University of Southern Mississippi, and we were very appreciative the last time you delivered the lecture to the University Forum. And I think our students and faculty know how to conduct themselves because you had no problem answering their questions whatsoever.
Yes, that's my preference.
I was very, very proud of how our faculty and students conducted themselves for the University Forum. So let's get back to your book, okay? Because that's why we're here, to talk about the book. First of all, why did you write the book?
Well, last year, there were probably at least a dozen books that came out on climate change. And obviously, the reason for that is it's a topic that affects all of our lives and will for the foreseeable future. So most of them that come out, for instance, don't have footnotes. We're scholars, so we kind of like footnotes.
Oh, do you ever have lots of footnotes? And I want to say this book is thoroughly researched. I was so impressed as an academic on not only all of the footnotes, but also the index. And this book has extensive material in footnote. So that I was very admirable. I'm going, I don't think I could ever write a book that it was as thoroughly researched as this book, and I teach research classes at the university. So it was excellent.
Well, I don't even know if you know this because it's quite recent, but the Association of American Publishers gives out a prize each year in 37 categories, and they just picked this book as the best book on environmental science in the United States for last year, which means it's under the final 37 books under consideration for the best book total. So why did I go to all this trouble? Most people that write books these days, they go to the internet. And there's a lot of stuff at the internet. Some of it you're not going to find because a Google search isn't going to find everything. But there's also a lot of stuff that's in documents in archives. So I spent a lot of time at the archives of the University of California, San Diego, because that's where modern climate science was pretty much created in the 1950s. And there are two big giants of climate science, Roger Revelle and Dave Keeling, who were there. And there are documents out the gazoo on every aspect of their life. So I went through those. I went to the American Association for Advancement of Science archives in Washington, and then I went to a lot of presidential libraries because I can get the behind the scenes view of what discussions are happening at the science office, at the economics office, at the political office. And also, having studied a lot of presidencies, I find we need to pay a little more attention to the people around them because they sometimes have a lot of influence. For instance, John Sununu was the chief of staff for George Herbert Walker Bush's presidency. And if you want to understand Bush's position on climate change, you have to look at Sununu. So my fear was that, and of course the people of this older era aren't alive anymore, so you can't do oral interviews. So my fear was we were going to go into this area where we're discussing a very important issue and we wouldn't understand the building blocks that have brought us to where we are today. And so a lot of times I hear the discussion of climate change and it's like, well, we solved that problem 50 years ago, you know, but people don't have the historical context. So I think this book has gotten a terrific reception from a lot of people who know a lot about climate change but are learning new things. But also, if a person was going to just read their first book, this sort of gives you, as I say, the building blocks of how we discovered the science and what happened politically to either act or not act.
What I was really surprised in terms of reading the book, and you might want to tell people who Roger Revelle was, because I'm sure most people don't even know, but he was already, like you said, studying climate issues back in the 1950s. That's like 70 years ago. And I don't think anyone except a few academics were aware that this was on people's radars 70 some years ago. So why don't you tell us a little bit about Roger Revelle and his significance?
Well, Revelle was a big deal in the world of science. He was the Navy, U.S. Navy's chief oceanographer during World War II. And so he was interconnected with, you know, people like Oppenheimer and...
Could I just give you a side comment on that? The Navy Oceanographic Command is now located in Mississippi, in Hancock County, and is affiliated with the University of Southern Mississippi, where we have a whole bunch of those oceanographers on our faculty. Okay. So I just needed to add that. A little plug for USA.
That is much appreciated. But he was even of such stature that he was invited to a state dinner by President Eisenhower. So if you go back to 1955, the state of climate science was we knew that carbon dioxide trapped heat. That was discovered by a woman named Eunice Foote, who presented a paper to the American Association for the Advancement of Science in 1856. So that's a bedrock of science. We know that the activities of humans are putting all this carbon dioxide into the atmosphere where it would trap heat. But until the mid-1950s, the assumption was it just fell back to the earth and got absorbed in the ocean and other places. And Revelle, as an oceanographer, said, no, the ocean can't accept all that carbon that quickly. There's a chemical balance there that it would be disrupted. So he gives a paper in 1955 that says, look, I think this stuff is staying up there, so we've got a real issue. And he was an outlier, but people couldn't ignore him because he was a big deal. And he was involved in the International Geophysical Year. He found the money for a guy named Dave Keeling to do the measurements. He went to a volcano in Hawaii and started collecting the measurements. And his data proved that Revelle was correct. And so we knew that by 1960. So that that comes as a shock to a lot of people. And then I find in Revel's files a letter from John F. Kennedy's speechwriting office saying, "Thank you for your help on the speech." So I said, "What speech?" So I go back and look, and Kennedy's actually talking about why we have to study the interaction between the atmosphere and the ocean because it affects our climate. He says that on 3 occasions. Shortly before his assassination, he's speaking at the 100th anniversary of the National Academy of Sciences. Who's sitting behind him? Professor Roger Revelle. So Revelle, I'm not a biographer. I'm in the intense historical research and then trying to explain it to the reader in a non-technical way so it's absorbable. But the book does have characteristics of a biography of Revelle, and some people remember him because he took a leave and taught at Harvard for a few years, where one of his students was Al Gore. I actually have the syllabus of that course with Gore's name on it. I've talked to 2 of the teaching assistants who are still alive. So Gore just sort of, and he's still a big deal just till he dies in the early 1990s. So if I do nothing else other than get people to pay more attention to who Roger Revelle was, I'll be happy.
Well, the thing that I find interesting about the book, too, is that you do not have to have a strong science education to read the book and understand. As you said, you're making this available basically to the layperson, and it tells this incredible story of the early study of climate science. And, you know, from my perspective, I didn't even hear about this until at least the late 1990s, or think that it was anything out there that was of significance. But it's been on people's radar for a long, long time.
Yeah, this is a tricky matter, and I try to be fair. For instance, what I say is if you look at Lyndon Johnson's presidency, and zoom in, you find a lot of interest in climate change. The Johnson White House issued a major report on it, written mainly by Revelle. But I say if you zoom out, what do you see in the Johnson administration? You see the war on poverty, you see the civil rights movement, you see the war in Vietnam. And so you can see why the climate change gets lost in the shuffle. Because this is the danger, and it's also maybe reassuring, that carbon dioxide stays up there for 100 years. So you have to sort of think in advance. And you say, well, okay, now, we're not seeing much effects of it yet. But yeah, it's building up. And it is technically possible to suck it out of the air. And at some point, we may decide we're just going to pay the price and do that. It's not the most efficient way to do it. Just don't put it up there in the first place. But so this, and one of the leading proponents of sucking it out of the air, Wally Brooker, was raised in Oak Park, Illinois, I'll have you know.
Another homie.
And he started at Wheaton College and ended up studying geology at Columbia and stayed there the rest of his life. But so Brooker, I try to take, if you take the understanding that the Earth circulates around the sun, that was a controversial idea in its time. So Copernicus and Galileo sort of were persecuted for this, but their names are in the textbook. So the kids learn, okay, here's who these people were, they're kind of heroes in science, and then they learn from that, well, how do we really know that the Earth circulates around the sun? Climate change is sort of the same way. When people are in school, they should learn who Roger Revelle is and who Wally Brooker is and who Dave Keeling is. So that I'm trying to nudge things in that direction, and we'll see how it goes.
I think it's a good direction in which to nudge things. I really do. And one of the things I said I really wanted to talk with you about, though, however, is Jimmy Carter. And the reason I wanted to talk with you about Jimmy Carter, and I was fascinated, I was reading the book, how much attention Jimmy Carter paid to this issue, which was really quite a lot. And I think part of that was, and maybe people don't know this about Carter, Carter himself was a scientist. Mm-hmm. And so he did have a scientific mind, a scientific mentality. and he was inclined to take the findings of science very seriously. And I know that you had a personal relationship with Carter, a very long-standing, serious personal relationship, and that your last gig before retiring to New Orleans was as the director of the Jimmy Carter Library in Atlanta. So talk to us a little bit about Jimmy Carter and his relationship to climate science.
Well, I'll sort of work backwards. The last public event the Carters did before their funerals was the 75th wedding anniversary, and so they invited enough people that would fit in the auditorium at Plains High School, which is the largest thing in the city. And I got a chance to chat with him. He was in a wheelchair at the time, and he recognized me from across the room. And when I got a chance to talk to him, I said, "You're going to be long remembered for what you did in solar energy." And he got a very large smile on his face. So there were a number, part of it is the time that he was president, because in 1977, there was a major report from the National Academy of Sciences on climate change, written by mainly Roger Revelle. And so this set off a chain reaction of a lot of studies that went on. And so it came to Carter's desk. And it was a difficult thing. I try to stress, John Dickinson wrote a book called The Hardest Job in the World. It's about being president. And so I try to present the choices that are before them. So Carter is pushing coal because that will help us wean off of oil from Saudi Arabia and other things. And so in one sense, the reports about climate change were not welcome because coal is the most polluting of the fossil fuels. So his science advisor comes to him and says, "Look, we need to do something here, but solar energy probably will not be cost effective till the 21st century. So we need to pour a lot of money into solar, and then we'll get the benefit." So look at this from a politician's standpoint. Politician, you're saying, okay, we're gonna have to spend this money now, and it won't really pay off until 6 or 7 presidents down the road. So he sets the bar that by the year 2000, we will get 20% of our energy from renewables. Well, when the year 2000 came about, it was a joke because we hadn't even increased the percentage from what it was when he was president. And there was a movie made, The Road Not Taken, and I was actually interviewed in the movie. But what was happening behind the scenes was solar was coming down, 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 down in price, up in efficiency, and it was starting to move to where it could be cost competitive. So the payoff came sort of around 2017 was when views started to change about, hey, solar not only is cleaner, it might also be cheaper. And so coincidentally, that was the year that Georgia Power decided to take 10 acres of Carter's farm and build a solar farm. And so Carter took a lot, as you say, he was an engineer, so I was told he went out and supervised the construction every day and made suggestions. But he was pretty sure that the electric company wouldn't tell the full story of solar power, so he insisted that I be the opening speaker for the event. And so he was he's a modest Baptist, so he couldn't brag about all he'd done, so I did it for him and said, look, Carter set this goal.
You call him a modest Baptist. Now, I know you grew up a Baptist.
Yes, I did.
So were you a modest or an immodest Baptist?
I have overcome my Baptist modesty.
Okay, good.
But I was bragging about him at that point. And so he was happy to hear that. And the New York Times reporter afterwards, I was listening to the conversation, he said, "Do you feel this is vindication of your position?" And Carter said, "Oh, no." I saw the smile on his face. He was very happy. So we forget history. We so oversimplify it. And so 20 years from now, we should realize that if it hadn't been for Carter, we'd be probably at least 15 years behind where we are today. And if we'd stayed pedal to the metal like he was going, we'd be at least probably 20 years ahead of where we are today in dealing with this big problem. And I think it's important to remind people of that the actions today have consequences for our children and our grandchildren. And if we really care about our children and grandchildren, that ought to be part of the calculus.
Yeah. And I think another thing that Carter was really dealing with in terms of the energy issue was an energy crisis, because during his presidency, he had to deal with 3 Mile Island, which really killed nuclear initiatives in many ways, and also with the Arab oil embargo, which was to a large extent why you had this emphasis on coal, if I remember correctly. So he's got all these things, these cross currents happening at the same time. He's trying to address what he knows is going to be ultimately a major issue, which is climate change. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, I would put a little more nuance on it. If someone likes this book, they might want to also look at another deeply researched book that I've done called Oil Crises, which is about how Nixon, Ford, and Carter handled energy issues in the 1970s. And there were 2 energy crises. The first one, called the Arab oil embargo, basically was from October of 73 to March of 74 when Nixon was president. And then it kind of receded to some extent. So in late 98, basically the Shah is overthrown, and it puts a new dynamic into Middle Eastern politics, because for a while Iranian oil production goes down to 0. This becomes the second oil crisis. And Saudi Arabia had the ability to help us make up the difference, and sometimes they did and sometimes they didn't. And it was all wrapped up in the Palestinian issue, which is still with us today. So I think there's a lot of learning in that book about the problems presidents face and how it affects us today.
So read book 1, and then you can come up with book 2, which is the follow-up. Okay.
Yeah, the most recent one I would say is the one I'm most proud of. I think it's the best writing I've done. But the second one is based on a very long period of study, getting access to a lot of previously classified materials. And I think, my last 2 books have been with university presses, so they don't necessarily get out quite as much as some of the commercial presses. But I'm very proud of the research that's in both of those books. And back to your talk about the sort of accessibility. In my years in government, I always declared war on acronyms. And so I try to follow through on that in the writing that I do. And occasionally I might use UN for United Nations or CBS for Columbia Broadcasting Company, but you will find a lot less acronyms in my books than you do on other books on the subject.
Okay. One other thing that I had forgotten about, but the book brought to mind, was something that occurred when I was in graduate school, actually. And you refer to it as the climate cooling detour. And I think that maybe, in a certain respect, hurt the initiative to deal with climate warming. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the climate cooling detour.
Yeah, I think it's good to clear that up, because I think neither side of the debate really understands it properly. In the study of data, you have symmetric data, which emissions go up and the accumulations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere go up more or less in tandem. Temperatures are a little bit more unruly. If you look at the temperature increases for the globe over a long period of time, it's clearly going up. But there are other factors that can offset and cool. For instance, a volcano is going to, a big volcano actually has enough impact to sort of have a cooling effect for a while. And then when you're emitting coal, you're also emitting sulfur dioxide, which has a cooling effect. It doesn't stay in the atmosphere for as long as carbon dioxide. So the scientists at first didn't understand that well, and there were some years where it cooled and they didn't understand carbon dioxide. So all of a sudden, and people get really scared when you talk about the ice age. That sounds very scary. So for a period of, I would say, 8 or 9 years, a lot of people sort of punted on the question, but when they corrected the models and took into account sulfur dioxide and the fact that we actually can trap sulfur dioxide at the electric plant so we don't inhale it, it's a big problem as a pollutant, but it also eliminates one of the cooling effects. So I said in my first book, before the two we mentioned, the environmentalists don't want you to know about it because they're afraid that you might want to leave the carbon dioxide in the air, and the climate deniers don't want you to know about it because once you understand it, you realize why it was a cooling detour, and we figured out what was happening, and the world indeed is warming. There's really no question of that. But the columnist George Will, every once in a while, every few years, he'll say, well, they haven't even figured out whether the world is cooling or warming. Well, yeah, we figured that out. Basically, I'd say by about 78 or 79, the science had all gelled that we understood what was going on.
I like George, but he's usually behind the times.
Well, in one little literary flourish, when I'm critiquing his critique, I adopt his alliterative style just for the heck of it. So you can search, anybody can search for that in the book. I actually have collected every editorial he's written over the years on climate change. They tend to pretty much repeat themselves.
One thing that I took note of is that you ended the book really with the years of George H. Bush, and of course the next president was Bill Clinton, and you didn't write anything about the Clinton years, and yet you were Clinton's Secretary of Energy Information. And I was thinking, why didn't Jay take this on through the Clinton years? It could have read like a personal memoir. Why?
Well, you raise two or three interesting questions. One is with a press, you get a word limitation for your book. So this book is 100.
Annoying, isn't it?
Yes. Any book that I write, I could have written one twice as long. So this book was 120,000 words. So originally I was going to start with Kennedy and go through Clinton because that would give me the 20th century. That was, and the Kyoto Treaty. But then I decided that the Eisenhower stuff was so interesting, I couldn't ignore it. And I didn't want to do a haphazard job on the early years because I felt like that was a real contribution to understanding. So I had to cut somewhere. Now, my editor said, well, maybe you can write a second book. And my wife didn't like that idea.
Well, can I add something to that? Whenever I call here, I get Anita on the phone, and I say, could I talk to Jay? And she says, yeah, he's up in his office writing another book.
But there is a very lengthy epilogue at the end in which I do cover Clinton, Bush, the second Bush, Obama, and Trump's first term, and Biden. The final summary is includes the Inflation Reduction Act, which is Biden's big bill. The reason I used the title I did was I didn't want to pretend that I had done the depth of research on that Clinton. Now, I've got a lot of research, but I feel like I've written the definitive work up to Bush. And I'm thinking of, for the next book, if I do it, that it will be more of a memoir type style. And I'm thinking of writing one on the car and the climate. And I would talk about the personal decisions I made in cars, or even as a kid in the mid-1950s, I went out to see the Chevrolet Corvette. I was the first person on the first day that the first electric vehicle was put out by Honda, I drove it. I think I was about the first American to drive the Prius when they brought one over from Japan. So when you work at the Department of Energy, you get to do all these cool things. So, and then how I struggle, like now, I have to have a car that I can escape a hurricane. And I want one that's environmentally sound. So how do I do that? An all-electric vehicle probably isn't going to get me to my son's house in Tallahassee. So I think I've done a lot of research on the book. I have followed automobile efficiency standards for years, so I think I can make that into an interesting book, because everybody, or not everybody, but a whole lot of people own cars, and then they struggle with what kind of car do I want to buy. And it's interesting to look at the car. And again, I've driven in Harry Truman's car, because they have one at the Truman Library, and before they put it, I arrived the day before they put it on display, so I got to drive it. I've been in the presidential limousine with Jimmy Carter. So there's all sorts of, little things in my life where cars are a part of it. And yet today, if you look at what is the cause in the United States of carbon dioxide emissions, the transportation sector is number one. So it's something that we can't ignore and we need to understand better. I'm going to probably publish a 20-page report this year about how we're not doing as well as we think we are on the car, and then maybe follow that up with a book.
That leads me to a final question, okay? And the final question is this, and I know you hate making projections. You don't consider yourself to be a fortune teller, I get that. But when do you think that electric vehicles will overtake internal combustion vehicles in terms of the number that are actually on the road?
On the road? Well, it'll go through a couple stages. One is when most new car purchases majority are electric, but as your question suggests, a car stays on the road for a long time. So to get to that second level where most of them, I think in terms of percentage of new car sales, I would say that the United States will be a laggard.
Oh, sure.
China will get there within the next 10 years, Europe not too much later than that. And in China, because there's not this embedded number of cars on the road because they haven't been rich enough to buy a lot of cars, I think they may get to where you're talking about, in 15 years. India now too, I think the electric cars are, and they don't, see, I drove the first Prius that came to this country, and they started apologizing for the car. And they said, well, we're going to make it accelerate faster for the Americans. This is the Japanese version. The Americans demand fast acceleration. What does fast acceleration do? It decreases mileage efficiency of the car. And it also, we want a certain level of torque in the car that it's a little bit hard for an electric car to generate, but it can. So in the rest of the world, they're not demanding the same kind of heavy, big vehicles that we are, so it's easier for them to switch to electric. But what I'm saying is, I wrote an article on this for Real Clear Energy several months ago, that it's not going to go as fast as some people are hoping, but it's not going to fall apart. It's going to happen, because if you drive an electric vehicle, they are fun to drive, they're quiet, they come with a lot of safety features. They almost accelerate too fast. So that's the direction we're headed. So then the question becomes, are we moving at a pace that the Earth is going to be, going to warm 3 degrees centigrade, or Celsius, which would be 4.5 Fahrenheit? We need to keep it well below that. Will we? We don't know. But somewhere down the road, someone will look back and give the human race a grade, just like you give your students, and we need to work a little harder to get a good grade.
I said that was the last question, but relative to that, I'm going to ask one more. What about carbon capture?
I think carbon capture needs to be part of the mix. People criticize it because they say, well, it'll deflect attention away from the primary goal of keeping the carbon from going up in the atmosphere in the first place. But we really have to do both, and the Inflation Reduction Act tries to do both. So because carbon dioxide is a global pollutant, you can put the equipment to suck it out of the atmosphere any place in the world, and it'll have the same effect on Louisiana, whether it's in Chicago or Saudi Arabia or Houston. And the economics of it, I think, will work out in some ways, because if you're Amazon or Google or people like that, you can afford the extra cost of carbon capture, and it may be attractive to your customers. Hey, they're sucking it out of the air. So there are a lot of ways that I think we can bring the cost down of carbon capture, but in no way should we assume that's enough of an answer that we can just keep spewing it up in the air.
Well, thank you, Jay. I've really appreciated this. Of course, we will continue our discussion as we always do whenever we get together. And once again, I would like to recommend this book, The Presidents and the Planet. It's a great book if you're interested at all about climate change, climate science, and yet are not technically attuned. So I really recommend it. It's just out, and it's published by Louisiana State University Press, and it's really one of a series of books that my friend Dr. Hakes has written, and he's got more, it looks like, on the horizon. So please pay attention until next time when you join us once again for Scholars at a Bar.